My name is Luna Nightfall. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in spaces where people rely on calm voices, steady hands, and the ability to read the room before anyone else realizes a room is shifting. I've been a coordinator, a mediator, a quiet problem solver, the kind of role that rarely comes with applause, but often comes with expectation. People usually describe me the same way: easy to work with, emotionally intelligent, understanding. Some say I'm strong in a gentle way, which often means they believe I'll bend before I break. Others underestimate me entirely, not because I lack competence, but because I don't announce it. I don't raise my voice. I don't dominate conversations. I listen. I absorb. I remember. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic way. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no explosive confrontations, no public humiliation. What you're about to hear is quieter than that, slower, more realistic, and maybe more unsettling because of it. For a long time, I lived inside a simple, unspoken agreement. I was expected to understand everyone, their stress, their bad days, their sharp words, their silence, their expectations. Empathy flowed one way, and I carried it willingly, until one day I noticed something small but undeniable. No one was trying to understand me. This story traces the emotional journey from that realization to the moment I stopped offering what was never returned. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. You'll hear about how invisibility can feel like safety at first, how being the reliable one quietly turns into being the expendable one. How disrespect rarely arrives loudly. It arrives softly, wrapped in familiarity, justified by history. And how silence, when chosen deliberately, can become a form of quiet dominance rather than surrender. There are moments in this story where nothing seems to happen on the surface. No raised voices, no ultimatums, just small shifts, internal decisions, subtle boundaries, strategic patience. The kind of changes people only notice when it's already too late to undo them. I'm telling this story honestly, without embellishment, because I think many of us have lived some version of it. Maybe you've been the one who absorbs emotional labor for everyone else. Maybe you've been praised for your empathy while being slowly depleted by it. Or maybe you've wondered what would happen if you stopped explaining yourself to people who never listened in the first place. This isn't a guide. It's not a warning. It's simply a record of what happened when I chose to step out of a role I never agreed to play, and what followed when I did it quietly. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently without judgment. Have you ever realized that you were being deeply understood by no one while being expected to understand everyone? To them, I was dependable in a way that felt almost invisible. I was the person who noticed things before they became problems, the one who stayed late without announcing it, the one who remembered birthdays, deadlines, unspoken tensions, and the emotional weather of a room. If something ran smoothly, my name was rarely attached to it. If something went wrong, I was often the quiet buffer, absorbing the impact before it reached anyone else. They didn't say this outright, of course. No one ever does. But over time, I understood the role I played in their internal maps of the world. I was the constant, the one who didn't need checking in on, the one who could handle it, the one who didn't require much explanation, appreciation, or pause. In meetings, People talked around me rather than to me. Decisions were made assuming I would adapt. Changes were announced with the expectation that I'd smooth the edges afterward. When someone needed understanding, they came to me. When someone needed patience, I was the default. When someone needed silence, I provided that too. And for a long time, I thought this meant I was trusted. There's a particular kind of invisibility that wears the mask of respect. It feels like being relied on, but not considered. Like being necessary, but not central. People knew I was competent, but they didn't feel the need to include me in the narrative of success. I existed in the margins, holding the story together while the others stood at the center. I didn't resent it at first. In fact, I rationalized it. I told myself that being low drama was a strength, that not needing validation meant I was emotionally mature, that my calm presence was its own reward. And maybe, at one point, that was true. But slowly, something subtle began to form beneath that acceptance. I noticed how often my flexibility was assumed rather than requested, how my availability was treated as infinite, how my silence was interpreted as agreement, even when no one had asked for my opinion. When I did speak, people nodded, but the conversation kept moving as if my words were decorative rather than directional. They often described me using the same phrases. Luna's so understanding. She gets it. She won't mind. Those last three words appeared more often than they should have. She won't mind became a shortcut, a justification, a permission slip. It meant meetings scheduled over my personal time, responsibilities added without conversation. Emotional weight was placed gently but persistently on my shoulders. After all, I was good at carrying things quietly. What they didn't see or didn't think to look for was whether I was ever being carried by anyone else. I became the listener for frustrations that weren't mine to solve, the mediator for conflicts I didn't create. The translator between personalities is too stubborn to meet halfway. And because I performed these roles well, they solidified. Success locked me in place. There's a strange irony in being praised for empathy. The more you have, the more people assume you can spare, and the less they consider the cost. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. That's important to say. There were no raised voices, no blatant cruelty, no single villain to point at. What existed instead was something far more common and harder to confront. A slow erosion of presence, a quiet assumption that my inner world was stable enough to never require attention. When I was tired, I didn't show it. When I was hurt, I processed it privately. When something felt unfair, I told myself it wasn't intentional. And because I didn't protest, no one thought to ask. Over time, I realized something uncomfortable. They knew who I was to them, but they had no idea who I was to myself. And perhaps worse, they had never been curious. That's the part people rarely talk about. Invisibility isn't always imposed. Sometimes it's co-created. I allowed myself to be known only for what I provided, not for what I needed. I became fluent in everyone else's emotional language while keeping my own untranslated. To them, I was calm, reliable, useful. To myself, I was becoming quiet in a way that felt hollow. At that stage, I still believed this was sustainable. I believed that being good, being patient, and being understanding would eventually balance out. That recognition would arrive naturally. That empathy, given long enough, would return on its own. I didn't yet understand that roles, once assigned, are rarely questioned, especially when they benefit everyone else. And so, without realizing it, I kept playing mine. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. That's what made it dangerous. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blurs into dozens of others when you look back. The meeting ran long. People were tired. Someone made a decision that affected my workload directly, added responsibilities, tighter timelines, and more coordination across teams. It was stated casually, as if it had already been agreed upon. I remember waiting for the pause, the small courtesy of being asked. It never came. Instead, someone smiled in my direction and said, "Luna will handle it. She always does." There was no malice in the tone, no challenge, just certainty. A few people nodded. Someone else moved on to the next agenda item. The room continued breathing as if nothing notable had occurred. Outwardly, I did what I'd always done. I nodded back. I made a brief clarifying comment. I mentally adjusted my schedule. The meeting ended. Everyone dispersed, lighter somehow, having offloaded something without resistance. Inside, something unfamiliar lingered. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt, at least not in the way we usually recognize. It was more like a thin, precise awareness, sharp enough to notice, small enough to ignore if I wanted to. I realized, for the first time, that no one had checked whether I could handle it. They simply assumed I would. That assumption sat with me longer than the added work ever did. Over the next few days, I replayed the moment, not obsessively, but thoughtfully. I tried to frame it generously. Maybe they were under pressure. Maybe they trusted me. Maybe I hadn't made my boundaries clear enough. I offered everyone the same empathy I'd always extended. But another question kept surfacing quietly. If the situation were reversed, would I have made that decision for them without asking? I knew the answer. I would have paused. I would have checked in. I would have noticed the shift in responsibility and named it. Not because I was better, but because I was trained, emotionally and professionally, to consider impact. That's when I understood the cut. It wasn't the workload. It wasn't the comment itself. It was the absence of awareness. The way my capacity had been treated as a given rather than a variable. The way my silence had been mistaken for consent. I didn't confront anyone, not because I was afraid, but because I was curious. I wanted to see if this moment was an anomaly or a pattern. And once you start watching for patterns, they appear everywhere, in small ways at first. A message sent late at night with an expectation of a response. A decision made in a side conversation that I was expected to implement without context. A joke that positioned me as the fixer, said with affection, but repeated often enough to feel limiting. Each moment on its own was easy to dismiss. Collectively, they formed a shape I couldn't unsee. What struck me most was how invisible these moments were to everyone else. No one else seemed to notice, no one commented, no one paused to ask how I was managing the accumulation. I started to understand something unsettling. Being emotionally perceptive does not mean others are emotionally perceptive toward you. Empathy, I realized, isn't automatically reciprocal. It flows toward where attention is directed, not toward where it is quietly supplied. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't demand immediate care, but it marked a boundary I hadn't known existed and hadn't known could be crossed so easily. I remember standing at my desk that evening, gathering my things, feeling an unfamiliar restraint. A question formed that I didn't yet know how to answer. What would happen if I stopped absorbing these moments without naming them, even to myself? At the time, I still chose familiarity. I still chose understanding. I told myself that this was the cost of being capable, that everyone carried something unseen. But something had shifted. I began to notice how often I was the emotional and logistical shock absorber in the room, how rarely that role rotated, how seamlessly my presence allowed others to remain unexamined. That awareness didn't make me colder. It made me quieter. And in that quiet, I began to remember things I'd previously let slide. Not to store them as grievances, but to see them clearly. For the first time, what makes subtle disrespect so effective is how easily it blends into routine. Once the first moment passed without friction, the others followed more comfortably. Not because people became intentionally unkind, but because nothing had challenged the assumption they were operating under. The system worked for them, and systems that work are rarely questioned. I began to notice how often my role was referenced without my presence. Decisions were framed with my involvement already embedded, as if I were a resource rather than a person. Luna can coordinate that. Luna will smooth it out. Luna understands how this works. No one asked if I wanted to be involved. No one checked whether I agreed with the direction. It was assumed that understanding meant alignment. And again, I adjusted. I told myself this was professional maturity. That is not every slight required attention. That harmony mattered more than correction. That if I disrupted the flow, I'd be seen as difficult, especially after years of being easy. There's a quiet pressure that comes with a consistent reputation. Once people know you as accommodating, any deviation feels like a betrayal of character rather than a reasonable boundary. I felt that pressure even before anyone voiced it, so I absorbed. When timelines tightened without discussion, I reorganized my evenings. When expectations expanded, I streamlined processes to make it possible. When emotional tension arose between others, I mediated with neutrality, even when it drained me. I didn't call it disrespect. I called it responsibility. That's how normalization happens. Not through cruelty, but through repetition, paired with rationalization. Each time something crossed a line, I redrew the line further back, telling myself I was being flexible rather than eroded. The most telling moments were the smallest ones. A meeting was rescheduled at the last minute with the note, "Hope that's okay." A task was handed off with, "You're the best person for this," as if praise replaced consent. A private frustration unloaded on me because I was safe. Safe. That word appeared often. I was safe to vent to, safe to rely on, safe to assume, safe apparently to overlook. What I didn't yet articulate, even to myself, was that safety without reciprocity becomes extraction. And still, I stayed quiet. Part of that silence came from empathy. I knew people were stressed. I knew the environment rewarded speed over reflection. I knew that pointing out subtle patterns made others uncomfortable. But another part came from habit. I had learned, long ago, that expressing discomfort required energy, that explaining myself meant navigating defensiveness, that it was often easier to carry the weight than to ask others to notice it. So I normalized what should have been questioned. There was a moment late one evening when I caught myself drafting an email that apologized for a delay I hadn't caused. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Something about the words felt automatic, rehearsed, too familiar. I deleted the apology. I didn't replace it with confrontation. I simply stated the facts. That small act felt strangely heavy, like lifting something I'd been leaning on without realizing it. And that's when it became clear how deeply the normalization had settled into my body, not just my behavior. Disrespect, when it's subtle, doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like an expectation you slowly internalize. You begin to anticipate the imbalance and adjust yourself preemptively. You become complicit in your own diminishment, not out of weakness, but out of conditioning. I wasn't being ignored. I was being relied on without consideration. And because I continued to perform well, there was no signal that anything was wrong. Excellence became camouflage. My composure reassured everyone that the system was fair, except it wasn't. There were days when I felt a quiet resentment rise, not toward specific people, but toward the role itself. A role that had been shaped without my input, maintained by my silence, and rewarded with more of the same. I started to ask myself questions I'd avoided before. Why was my empathy always available but rarely invited in return? Why was my adaptability treated as infinite? Why did understanding seem to exempt others from understanding me? I didn't yet know what I would do with these questions, but asking them changed something fundamental. I stopped assuming the imbalance was accidental, and once you stop believing something is accidental, you begin to see it as a structure. That's when the discomfort shifted from emotional to ethical. I could continue as I was, quiet, capable, unseen, or I could begin to examine the cost of staying that way. At the time, I still chose quiet, but it was no longer unconscious. It was the last stage of normalization, when you know something is wrong, but haven't yet decided to stop it. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It assembled itself slowly, piece by piece, until the shape became undeniable. I had been assigned a role, not through a conversation, not through consent, but through repetition and convenience. Through my past responses becoming predictions of my future ones. Through my silence being interpreted as preference. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the person who would catch what others dropped and never ask who let go. Once I saw the role clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how people spoke differently around me. Not cautiously, comfortably. They assumed I wouldn't react strongly, wouldn't push back, wouldn't take things personally. My emotional range in their minds had narrowed to something manageable. I wasn't volatile. I wasn't demanding. I wasn't unpredictable. I was useful. That word carries a strange weight when you sit with it long enough. Useful isn't inherently negative. But when usefulness becomes the primary way people relate to you, it begins to eclipse your humanity. I wasn't being asked what I thought. I was being told what would happen, with the expectation that I would translate intention into execution. When disagreements arose, my role was to de-escalate. When plans failed, my role was to repair. When others felt overwhelmed, my role was to absorb. And because I did these things well, the role hardened. I began to see how little space there was for me to change. Any attempt to step outside the role was met with subtle surprise, a raised eyebrow, a pause. Ah, that doesn't sound like you. Those words weren't meant to correct me. They were meant to return me to form. There's a quiet coercion in being consistently labeled. Once people decide who you are to them, deviation feels like disruption, even when it's healthy, especially when it threatens the comfort of others. What struck me most was that no one seemed to consider whether the role served me. It served the group. It served efficiency. It served emotional convenience. It did not serve a balance. I thought about how often I had extended understanding without receiving curiosity. How often my inner world had been assumed to be stable enough to ignore. How rarely anyone had asked, genuinely, how I was managing everything I held. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been simpler. I was clear. Clarity has a way of stripping away illusion without drama. Once I understood the role, I understood the expectations attached to it. And once I understood the expectations, I could see the invisible contract I'd been honoring alone. The contract went something like this. I would remain calm, adaptable, and emotionally available. In return, I would be trusted, but not prioritized, relied upon, but not protected, praised, but not considered. I hadn't signed that contract, but I had upheld it. The most difficult part of this realization was acknowledging my own participation, not in blame, but in responsibility. I had trained people unintentionally to see me this way. I had met every assumption with compliance, every overreach with understanding. I had mistaken endurance for virtue. That night, I sat with a question that felt heavier than the others. If I stopped fulfilling this role, who would I become to them? The answer was unsettling, not because I feared rejection, but because I suspected indifference. Roles create visibility. Remove the role, and sometimes the person disappears with it. That thought didn't make me cling tighter. It made me curious about what would happen if I loosened my grip. I didn't plan anything yet. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a boundary overhaul. That would have been too loud, too reactive. Instead, I began to observe with intention. I watched how often assumptions were made in my absence. I listened to how my name was used as a solution rather than a participant. I paid attention to how rarely anyone asked for my perspective unless it solved a problem. And I documented it, not emotionally, but factually. Dates, decisions, language, patterns, not as ammunition, as information. Understanding the role I'd been assigned didn't make me bitter. It made me strategic. Because once you see the shape of a system, you stop taking it personally. You start deciding whether you're willing to keep sustaining it. At that moment, I still hadn't decided, but the role no longer fit the way it once had. And I knew that eventually something would have to shift, quietly or not. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no breaking point anyone else could point to later and say, that's when things changed. It happened on an ordinary morning. I was sitting alone, earlier than usual, reviewing notes from the week before. Nothing dramatic, just timelines, decisions, small moments I'd begun to track with quiet precision. The room was still. No messages yet. No demands. Just space. And in that space, a thought surfaced fully formed, without urgency or emotion. I don't owe my understanding to people who have never tried to understand me. The sentence didn't feel angry. It felt factual. I read it again in my mind. The way you reread something that finally explains a long-standing confusion. For years, I had treated empathy as a default setting. Automatic, unconditional, endlessly renewable. I had offered it even when it wasn't requested, even when it wasn't reciprocated. But that morning, I saw the imbalance clearly, without defensiveness. Empathy, I realized, is not a personality trait. It's a resource. And like any resource, when it flows in one direction for too long, something downstream begins to dry out. I thought about all the moments I'd softened my reactions to make others comfortable. All the times I'd reframed disrespect as misunderstanding, all the energy spent interpreting tone, intention, context, for people who had never paused to do the same for me. There was no villain in this realization, no one to blame neatly, just a system that had evolved because it was efficient and because I had enabled it. What shifted wasn't my behavior yet. It was my allegiance. For the first time, I felt more loyal to my internal clarity than to external harmony. That distinction matters. Harmony often asks the quietest person to stay quiet. Clarity asks the honest question, at whose expense? Later that day, something small tested this new awareness. A request came in, casual, vaguely worded, time sensitive, and assumed. It would have required me to rearrange my schedule with little notice. In the past, I would have responded immediately with reassurance. This time, I paused, not dramatically, just long enough to notice the familiar pull, the reflex to accommodate, to smooth, to disappear into usefulness. And then, instead of explaining or apologizing, I asked a simple question. What's the flexibility on the timeline? That was it. No justification, no emotional framing, just a question. The response was delayed. When it came, it was slightly surprised, slightly defensive, and ultimately revealing. There was flexibility. There had always been. The assumption had simply been that I would adjust. That moment confirmed what I'd sensed earlier. The system wasn't rigid. It had just never been tested. I didn't feel empowered. I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes when you stop arguing with reality and start responding to it. The shift continued quietly over the following days. I began to notice my internal responses changing before my external ones did. Where I once felt a sense of obligation, I now felt choice. Where I once anticipated needs automatically, I waited to see if they would be voiced. This wasn't withdrawal, it was recalibration. I still did my work. I still showed up. I still cared. But I stopped overfunctioning in silence. I stopped filling gaps that no one acknowledged. I stopped translating other people's urgency into my responsibility. What surprised me most was how uncomfortable this felt. Not to others, but to me. There's a strange grief in letting go of a role you've been praised for. A fear that without it, you'll be less valuable, less needed, less seen. I sat with that discomfort instead of rushing to soothe it. I asked myself something I'd never asked before. What would it mean to be respected rather than relied upon? The answer wasn't immediate, but the question stayed with me. That day didn't end with a resolution. Nothing was fixed. No one noticed anything different yet. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I stopped offering empathy by default. I began offering it deliberately, and that distinction, small as it seems, would quietly change everything that followed. After the shift, silence no longer happened to me. I chose it. Before, my quietness had been reactive, a way to maintain balance, avoid friction, keep things moving. Now, it has become intentional, measured, observant. I stopped rushing to fill pauses. I stopped clarifying assumptions that hadn't been voiced. I let moments hang just long enough to reveal what people expected me to do next. And in that space, patterns surfaced more clearly than ever. Requests came in the same way they always had, casual, open-ended, framed as inevitabilities. The difference was that I no longer responded immediately, not to be difficult, but to be accurate. I read messages fully before replying. I considered whether something was truly mine to carry or simply being placed in my direction out of habit. Sometimes I declined, politely, briefly, without justification beyond what was necessary. Other times I agreed, but with conditions that had previously gone unspoken. Timelines, scope, shared responsibility. Each time the reaction followed a familiar rhythm. First surprise, then mild confusion. Occasionally a trace of irritation was quickly masked as humor or concern. You're unusually quiet lately. Everything okay? You've changed. Those comments weren't accusations. They were adjustments. The system was noticing resistance where there had been none before. What struck me was how quickly silence was interpreted as weakness. Because I wasn't explaining myself emotionally, some assumed I was disengaged. Because I wasn't over-communicating, some assumed I was unsure. The absence of my usual reassurance unsettled people more than any direct confrontation would have. I didn't correct these assumptions. I watched. I noticed how often others filled the silence with their own narratives, how they projected intention onto my restraint, how quickly they revealed their expectations once I stopped managing them. Silence, I learned, is a mirror, and what it reflected wasn't always flattering. There were moments when the old reflex returned, the urge to soften, to clarify, to make others comfortable, especially when someone seemed unsettled by my change in behavior. I felt the familiar pull of empathy rising, ready to smooth the tension. But I paused and asked myself a new question. Is this discomfort mine to resolve? Most of the time, it wasn't. By not rushing in, I allowed others to sit with their own assumptions. Some adjusted, some didn't. That distinction became important later. What I didn't do was announce my shift. I didn't frame it as a boundary conversation or a personal evolution. That would have invited negotiation, explanation, justification. Instead, I let my behavior speak quietly and consistently. I showed up on time. I did my work well. I communicated clearly. And I stopped compensating for what wasn't mine. This consistency confused people more than inconsistency ever could. There was nothing to challenge directly, no emotional outburst to point to, no conflict to resolve, just a subtle absence, the absence of immediate availability, the absence of emotional cushioning, the absence of my automatic understanding. In that absence, some people stepped up. They clarified their requests. They shared responsibility. They asked rather than assumed. Others grew distant, less communicative, slightly colder. That was information, too. Silence revealed who valued me for my presence and who valued me for my function. And once you see that distinction, it's impossible to unsee. I didn't feel powerful. I felt precise. I began to understand that quiet dominance doesn't come from control. It comes from self-regulation, from not over-explaining, from not rushing to be liked at the expense of being respected. The irony was that the less I tried to manage perceptions, the more clearly people revealed theirs. I wasn't invisible anymore, not because I demanded attention, but because my absence from old patterns created contrast. Still, no one confronted me directly. Not yet. They sensed a change but couldn't name it. And without a name, they couldn't address it. Systems don't like unnamed variables, so they adapted, awkwardly, inconsistently, revealingly, and I kept choosing silence, not as retreat, but as a position. Because now silence wasn't where I hid. It was where I stood. While the surface stayed calm, something else was happening beneath it. Because I wasn't spending energy cushioning everyone else, I had more of it. Not dramatically more, just enough to think clearly, to observe without urgency, to notice details I'd previously filed away as background noise. They never noticed the shift in how I listened. I still nodded, still took notes, still asked clarifying questions, but I stopped volunteering solutions before they were requested. I stopped closing loops that others left open. I allowed processes to reveal their weaknesses instead of compensating for them. And as those weaknesses surfaced, I began to document, not out of spite, but out of pattern recognition. Dates, language used in decisions, who assumed what, who benefited, who absorbed the cost. It wasn't a dossier. It was a map. I also started learning things no one realized I didn't already know. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly expanding my understanding of systems that had previously been opaque because I'd never needed to question them. Financial workflows, decision hierarchies, approval chains, where accountability was clear and where it dissolved conveniently. I noticed how often I was positioned as the final step in a process that had no formal ownership, how ambiguity upstream became urgency downstream. With me in the middle, once you stop rushing, the structure becomes visible. I began to see how much institutional knowledge I carried that existed nowhere else. Not because I hoarded it, but because I'd been the one stitching fragmented information together for years. I knew the history behind decisions, the reasons certain compromises had been made, the context that was never written down. They saw me as replaceable because my work looked seamless. They didn't realize the seams existed because I'd been hiding them. So I stopped hiding them, not publicly, not defensively. I simply stopped compensating in advance. When something was unclear, I asked for clarification instead of inferring. When information was missing, I requested it instead of reconstructing it myself. When decisions lacked ownership, I named that gap without filling it. Each time people stumbled slightly. Can you just... I thought you knew. Didn't we already? No, you hadn't. You just assumed I would. I also noticed something else they never saw coming. I was becoming less emotionally available. Not colder, but more contained. I listened without absorbing. I acknowledged without resolving. I let people sit with their own discomfort instead of translating it into action for them. That space changed the dynamic. People began to reveal how much they relied on my emotional labor without ever naming it as such. How often have they outsourced reflection, regulation, and follow through to me? I didn't take this personally, I took it seriously. Because systems that rely on invisible labor collapse when that labor becomes visible or unavailable. Quietly, I positioned myself differently. I aligned my responsibilities with documented authority. I clarified my scope in writing. I ensured that decisions flowed through proper channels instead of informal expectations. Not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of accuracy. No one objected. Why would they? Everything I did was reasonable, professional, hard to argue with. That's the thing about preparation. When done well, it doesn't look like resistance. It looks like competence. I also began to prepare emotionally. I detached from the need to be understood by people who had never tried. I stopped hoping that my shift would inspire self-reflection in others. I let go of the fantasy that clarity on my part would lead to accountability on theirs. Instead, I focused on alignment. What did I want my work to feel like? What standards would I hold, regardless of others' comfort? What was I no longer willing to normalize? These questions guided my actions quietly and consistently. They never noticed how much leverage I had accumulated simply by staying present while stepping back. They never noticed that I was no longer the emotional glue holding everything together. They only noticed when small things stopped sticking, when communication slowed, when tasks bounced back, when assumptions met questions instead of compliance. By then, the preparation was already well underway, not because I planned to expose anyone, not because I wanted control, but because I had finally stopped sacrificing myself to keep a flawed system running smoothly. And once you stop doing that, the system has to reveal itself. That revelation was coming. They just didn't know it yet. The reveal didn't arrive with adrenaline. It arrived with stillness. One evening, after everyone else had logged off, I sat alone with the accumulated clarity of months. Notes, documents, process maps, email threads that told a story no one had ever bothered to read all the way through. not because it was hidden, but because it was inconvenient. And in that quiet, something became unmistakably clear. I wasn't just involved in the system, I was stabilizing it. For years, I had been the connective tissue between decisions that didn't quite align. I had smoothed contradictions. I had translated vague authority into executable action. I had absorbed ambiguity so others could feel certain. The system didn't function because it was well designed. It functioned because I compensated for its flaws. That was the leverage, not in a dramatic sense, not something that could be weaponized, but something that could no longer be ignored once named, even if only to myself. I traced the pathways carefully. What happened when I wasn't available? Where decisions stalled? Which processes quietly rerouted back to me? How often my judgment substituted for formal approval? It wasn't flattering. It was sobering. I saw how risk had been distributed unevenly, how responsibility traveled downward while credit traveled up, how my role had been framed as support, while in practice, it was structural. They hadn't done this maliciously. Systems rarely are. They evolve around whoever makes them work. And I had made it work for a long time. The private reveal wasn't about exposing anyone else. It was about finally seeing myself clearly, not as the helper, not as the mediator, not as the understanding one, but as a point of failure the system had never planned for. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me careful. Because once you know where stability actually lives, you understand how fragile it is. I also understood something else. If I ever tried to explain this out loud, it would sound like an exaggeration, or ego, or threat. So I didn't explain it. I just adjusted accordingly. I began documenting knowledge that had previously lived only in my head. I clarified ownership in writing, not aggressively, just accurately. I stopped answering questions that should have gone elsewhere. I redirected instead of resolving. Each adjustment was small, individually reasonable, collectively significant, and still no one noticed. Because from the outside, everything looked mostly fine. That's the illusion of invisible labor. Its absence isn't immediately dramatic. It's cumulative, delayed, disorienting. Privately, I reached a calm certainty. I didn't need to prove my value. I didn't need acknowledgement. I didn't even need agreement. I needed alignment with myself. I asked a question that felt irreversible the moment it formed. If I continue as I am, what kind of future am I consenting to? The answer was clear and unacceptable. The private reveal wasn't a turning point others could mark on a timeline. It was an internal closure. The moment I stopped hoping the system would recognize me fairly and started recognizing myself accurately, I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. There was only clarity and responsibility. Because once you see the truth of your position, staying silent about it becomes a choice rather than a habit. And I was already choosing differently. What came next wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be reactive. But it would be irreversible. Clarity narrows your options. That's the part no one tells you. Once you truly understand a situation, pretending you don't becomes a form of self-betrayal. I reached a point where I could see every possible path forward, and none of them were neutral. There were three options. The first was to continue as I had been, now with full awareness, to keep stabilizing the system quietly while managing my own expectations. To accept that empathy would remain one-directional and adjust my internal narrative accordingly. That option required numbness. I wasn't willing to cultivate that. The second was confrontation, a clear, direct conversation naming patterns, roles, and imbalances. It would be reasonable, justified, even overdue. But I knew this system. I knew how it defended itself. Confrontation would trigger explanations, not change. Promises, not restructuring. Temporary awareness followed by gradual reversion. And most importantly, it would position me as the problem for noticing what everyone else benefited from ignoring. I didn't want to be managed. I wanted to be free. The third option was the quiet one: to stop participating in the imbalance without announcing it, to remove myself from being the silent stabilizer, to let the system experience the natural consequences of its design, not as punishment, as feedback. This option required patience, precision, and a willingness to be misunderstood. I chose the third, not because it was safer, but because it was honest. The decision wasn't emotional, it was logistical. I looked at timelines, obligations, transition points. I assessed what I could ethically step back from without harming anyone. I ensured that nothing I did would be reckless or abrupt. This wasn't about collapse, it was about alignment. I began to disentangle my identity from my usefulness. I stopped measuring my worth by how indispensable I was. I stopped performing reliability as a form of security. That shift was quieter than any announcement, but far more final. There was a moment late one night when I closed my notebook and realized I wouldn't be reopening it for observation much longer. The preparation phase was ending. What followed would be action, not visible yet, but set in motion. I didn't feel fear. I felt relief, because the indecision had been the heaviest part. Once I chose, the path simplified. I accepted that some people would feel blindsided later, not because I hadn't been clear, but because they hadn't been paying attention. I accepted that my silence would be interpreted as compliance until it wasn't. And I accepted that I wouldn't be explaining myself when that moment came. The decision point isn't dramatic from the outside. No one notices when someone stops overextending. No one marks the moment someone withdraws from a role they never agreed to. But internally, it's definitive. I stopped asking, "How do I make this work?" I started asking, "What am I no longer willing to sustain?" From that point on, every action followed a single principle: do nothing that requires you to disappear. That principle guided everything that came next. And once it was in place, there was no going back. Once the decision was made, there was no urgency. That's something people misunderstand about change. The most irreversible shifts don't rush. They settle. They move with intention, not speed. I didn't announce anything. I didn't reduce my performance or disengage emotionally. From the outside, I looked the same: calm, competent, present. That continuity was important. It allowed the contrast to form naturally. What changed was where I placed my effort. I began aligning every action with formal responsibility. If something wasn't explicitly mine, I didn't preemptively take it on. If a decision required authority I didn't hold, I documented that and waited. If a request lacked clarity, I asked for it in writing. These weren't power moves, they were boundary corrections. I ensured that my work was visible in the right places, not as self-promotion, but as traceability. I stopped shielding others from the consequences of vague decisions. I let timelines reflect reality instead of optimism. Quietly, the system slowed. Not dramatically, just enough to feel friction. People began to sense delays without understanding the cause. Tasks took longer. Decisions looped back. Questions landed where they should have gone in the first place and stayed there. I didn't intervene. I also made sure I was protected. I clarified my scope formally. I documented dependencies. I confirmed expectations in writing. I didn't frame these actions as concern. I framed them as alignment, accuracy, professional hygiene. No one objected, because nothing I did could be reasonably challenged. That's the strength of moving in silence. When actions are grounded in clarity, they don't provoke resistance. They simply remove shortcuts. At the same time, I began disentangling myself emotionally. I stopped offering reassurance when people were unsettled by the system's friction. I listened without absorbing. I acknowledged without smiling. I allowed others to experience the discomfort of accountability. That discomfort revealed a lot. Some people adapted quickly. They clarified their thinking, took ownership, adjusted their expectations. Others grew anxious, shorter, less patient. Still, no one confronted me directly, because from their perspective, nothing wrong was happening. The system was simply different. I knew what was coming before they did, because I had seen the map. I knew which processes relied on my invisible intervention. I knew which people were accustomed to my quiet compliance. And I knew that once the consequences became noticeable, the search for answers would begin. I wasn't hiding, I was just no longer compensating. That distinction mattered. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about refusing to explain yourself to people who haven't done the work to understand. Weeks passed. The friction accumulated. Small misses became noticeable gaps. Minor delays became questions. Questions became a concern. Still, no one traced it back to me. They couldn't, because nothing I was doing violated any rule. In fact, everything I was doing aligned more closely with the rules than before. That's the quiet irony. Systems often depend on rule bending to function smoothly. When someone stops bending, the dysfunction surfaces, and the person who stops bending isn't at fault. They're just no longer hiding the fault. I stayed steady, present, precise. I didn't accelerate. I didn't retreat. I waited, because silence, when paired with consistency, doesn't need reinforcement. It creates inevitability. The first signs didn't arrive as blame. They arrived in confusion. A missed handoff here, a delayed response there, small disruptions that felt disproportionate to their cause. People noticed, but they couldn't yet locate the source of the problem. They asked questions in group chats. They double-checked timelines. They scheduled extra meetings. I watched it unfold with a kind of detached clarity, because I knew what they were experiencing wasn't new. It was simply no longer being absorbed. For years, I had quietly corrected misalignments before they surfaced. Now, without that intervention, the system was encountering itself. At first, people assumed it was temporary. A bad week, competing priorities, external pressure. They worked around it, the way they always had. Except this time, there was no one smoothing the edges for them. The work felt heavier, not because there was more of it, but because it was no longer distributed invisibly. I noticed how quickly conversations shifted from confidence to uncertainty. How often did phrases like, "I thought," and "didn't we already," begin to appear? The casual certainty people once carried started to fray, and still, no one pointed at me. Because nothing I had done was overt. I continued to deliver exactly what I was responsible for, no more, no less. When something fell outside that scope, it stayed there. People began to feel the absence without recognizing its shape. That's when the emotional reaction started. Frustration surfaced in small ways, shorter emails, tighter tones, subtle impatience. The system, under strain, began to show its stress responses. Some people responded by trying to reassert old patterns. They'd send messages framed as reminders rather than requests. They'd reference past behaviors as justification. "This is how we've always done it. You usually handle this." I responded calmly, factually, and consistently. "I don't have the authority for that." That decision sits with X. I'll need clarity before proceeding. No defensiveness, no apology, just reality. Others responded differently. They started asking better questions, slowing down, taking ownership, clarifying roles. Those people didn't experience the friction as a threat. They experienced it as feedback. That contrast became impossible to ignore. The system wasn't failing, it was being tested. And the test revealed who had been relying on invisible labor and who was willing to adjust when it became visible. I could feel the emotional temperature rising, but it wasn't directed at me yet. It was diffuse, directionless, searching for a cause. That's the stage people often mistake for chaos. It isn't chaos, it's a transition. And transitions are uncomfortable because they remove familiar shortcuts. I stayed steady. I didn't offer explanations preemptively. I didn't justify my behavior. I didn't soften the experience for anyone, not out of cruelty, but out of respect. Respect for the truth of the system. Respect for myself. One afternoon, I overheard someone say, "Things just feel harder lately." They weren't wrong, but what they meant was, things feel harder now that someone isn't making them easy for us. The consequences weren't dramatic. No one lost anything tangible yet, but something had shifted. Certainty was gone, and once certainty disappears, people start paying attention. That attention was moving closer. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, they were already asking the wrong questions. The tone changed first. Meetings grew tense. Agendas became crowded with alignment discussions that circled the same unresolved issues. People started searching for efficiency tools, new processes, and external explanations. No one looked at the invisible labor that had quietly disappeared. That kind of absence is hard to name, especially when it was never acknowledged in the first place. I noticed how often people tried to recreate the old flow without examining why it had existed. They added steps, introduced checklists, scheduled more syncs, all attempts to replace something they couldn't see, and still the friction remained. That's when the panic began, not overt, but palpable. Deadlines slipped, decisions stalled, people grew defensive over responsibilities they hadn't clearly owned before. The emotional tone shifted from confidence to irritation to unease. Someone finally said it out loud, though not to me. "Why does everything feel so complicated now?" The answer was simple. Because it always was. I had just stopped making it look simple. That's when the reach-outs began. Casual at first. "Hey, quick question." Then more pointed. "Can you help clarify?" Eventually, concern masked as care. "We've noticed you've been quieter. Is everything okay?" I responded kindly, professionally, briefly. "Yes, everything's fine. Happy to clarify within my scope. Let's make sure the right owner is looped in." What I didn't do was step back into the role they missed. By then it was too late. Not because I was unwilling, but because the system had already revealed itself. Reverting would have required me to disappear again, and I wasn't willing to do that. Some people tried to fix things relationally. They were warmer, more attentive, a little late. Others tried to reassert authority, subtly reminding me of expectations that had never been formalized. Neither approach worked, because the issue wasn't attitude. It was structured, and structure doesn't change through tone. I could sense the confusion turning into frustration. People wanted a lever to pull, a person to correct, a solution to implement. But the truth was inconvenient. The system needed to be redesigned, and I was no longer the one doing that quietly in the background. There was a moment when someone said with genuine bewilderment, "I didn't realize how much you handled." That wasn't an apology. It was a revelation. And revelations come too late to preserve what they expose. I felt no satisfaction in this, only confirmation. Because what was breaking wasn't the system itself, but the illusion that it had ever been self-sustaining. People often believe things work because they're well designed. They rarely notice the human cost until it stops being paid. I didn't escalate. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I simply remained where I was, present, clear, unavailable for the role they wanted me to resume. By the time they understood the depth of the imbalance, the window for quiet correction had closed. Any attempt to fix things now would have required a visible reckoning, and visible reckonings make people defensive. They also require humility. Not everyone was ready for that, so they hesitated. And in that hesitation, the consequences deepened. The system could no longer be patched, only changed. The conversation, when it finally happened, was quieter than anyone expected. No raised voices, no accusations, no emotional spillover. Just a meeting scheduled with unusual formality and an unusual number of people in the room. I could feel the tension before anyone spoke. Not hostility, uncertainty, the kind that comes when people sense they're standing at the edge of something they didn't plan for. They began carefully. Questions framed as observations. Concerns are wrapped in neutral language. References to recent challenges and misalignment. I listened without interrupting, not because I was passive, but because I was finished explaining like to people who had never asked to understand me before things became difficult for them. Eventually, someone said it plainly. You've pulled back. I didn't disagree. I didn't defend it either. I simply said, I've been working within my defined responsibilities. Silence followed. Not resistance. Processing. Another voice entered, softer. We didn't realize how much you were handling. That sentence hung in the air longer than anything else. I acknowledged it with a nod. No satisfaction. No relief, because realization doesn't undo impact. They asked what I needed. That question would have mattered months ago. Now it felt incomplete. I need clarity, I said, on ownership, on expectations, on what's actually sustainable. No emotional framing, no history lesson, just structure. Some people nodded. Others looked unsettled, because structure removes ambiguity, and ambiguity has been convenient. They wanted reassurance, a signal that things would return to normal, that I would resume smoothing the edges once we'd all acknowledged the issue. I didn't offer that, not out of defiance, but because normal had required my invisibility, and I wasn't willing to return to that. I wasn't angry. That surprised them most. Anger would have made this easier to categorize. Instead, I was calm, grounded, finished. The conversation ended without resolution. Not because we were stuck, but because everyone understood something had shifted permanently. They couldn't unsee what they now knew, and I couldn't unknow what I had already accepted. When I left the room, I felt lighter. Not because I'd won anything, but because I hadn't compromised so to be understood. For the first time, I hadn't translated my experience into something easier for others to digest. I had stated it plainly and left it there. That was enough. I didn't become harder after that. I became clearer. There's a difference that often gets misunderstood. Hardness is defensive. Clarity is grounded. One closes you off. The other defines you. In the weeks that followed, the environment adjusted. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but honestly. Roles were revisited. Responsibilities were named. Some friction remained, but it was visible now, which made it negotiable rather than silently absorbed. And me, I stopped measuring my value by how much I could carry. I no longer rushed to anticipate needs that hadn't been expressed. I didn't translate discomfort into action unless it was mine to take. I allowed myself to be seen only where I chose to be present. This didn't make me less empathetic. It made my empathy precise. I still listened, still cared, still showed up with integrity, but I no longer offered understanding as a default. I offered it where there was curiosity, accountability, and reciprocity. That shift changed how people interacted with me. Some relationships deepened. When empathy was mutual, it grew stronger. Conversations became more honest, boundaries clearer, respect tangible. Other relationships faded, not dramatically, not painfully. They simply had no foundation once my role disappeared, and I let them go without resentment. Because I finally understood something essential. Not every connection is meant to survive your clarity. I became more selective with my energy, not guarded, but intentional. I paid attention to how I felt after interactions, rather than how well I performed during them. Calm replaced tension, not because everything was easy, but because nothing required me to disappear. I also noticed how my presence changed. I spoke less, but with more weight. I asked fewer questions, but better ones. I didn't fill the silence, and people listened more closely when I broke it. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-trust, about knowing that you don't need to prove your value to people who benefit from misunderstanding it. I no longer explained my boundaries in advance. I let them be experienced. I didn't justify my choices emotionally. I let them stand. That composure, steady, unreactive, did more than any argument ever could. It redefined me in the system, not as the fixer, not as the mediator, not as the one who wouldn't mind, but as someone whose presence required consideration. And the most surprising part? I didn't lose myself in the process. I found myself, stripped of the performance, freed from the role, anchored in something quieter and more durable than approval. I was no longer invisible, not because I demanded to be seen, but because I stopped standing in places where invisibility was required. This story doesn't end with triumph. It ends with alignment. There's no moment where everyone suddenly understands, apologizes, and changes. Real life doesn't offer that kind of symmetry. What it offers instead is something quieter and more sustainable. Choice. For a long time, I believed empathy was something you owed the world simply for having it. That being understanding was a moral good, regardless of whether it was returned. And while empathy is powerful, I've learned that unreciprocated empathy becomes self-erasure. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, through habit, expectation, and silence. I wasn't punished for being empathetic. I was used to it. And the moment I stopped offering it freely, without context or care, the imbalance revealed itself. That's the part I want to be clear about. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't withdrawal. This wasn't an emotional shutdown. It was a recalibration. I didn't take anything away from anyone. I simply stopped giving what was never acknowledged as labor in the first place. I stopped cushioning systems that benefited from my quiet exhaustion. I stopped explaining my worth to people who had never questioned their access to it. And when I did, the consequences weren't explosive. They were instructive. People learned, some consciously, some painfully, that what they had called the way things work had actually been the way someone was working for them, silently, relentlessly, at a cost. I don't regret my empathy. It taught me depth, perception, and restraint. But I no longer mistake empathy for obligation. I no longer confuse understanding with compliance. And I no longer believe that being low maintenance means being low impact. Quiet dominance doesn't look like winning. It looks like not abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. It looks like refusing roles that require your disappearance. It looks like letting systems feel their own weight. It looks like walking away from dynamics that only function when you are unseen. And perhaps most importantly, it looks like peace that doesn't depend on being needed. If you've ever been the one who understands everyone else. If empathy has always flowed outward but rarely returned. If you've been praised for your patience while feeling quietly depleted, then this story wasn't just mine, it was a mirror. So I'll leave you with one question, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. What would change in your life if you stopped offering empathy to people who have never tried to understand you? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.